Ever made a candle before? No? Me neither. But don't sweat it. Let's make one together. But let's do this as a scientist would. That's me. Hi, my name is Nikki Vo, and welcome to my lab. I'm a seasoned chemist with over 20 years of experience developing successful innovations and climbing that corporate ladder. However, at the age of 47, I realized I'm no longer living life on my terms. So in this channel, I'm bringing all those years of experience and rediscovering who I am and rebuilding the life that I truly want. My goal is to share with you all that knowledge so you too can rediscover yourself and build life on your terms. Join me on my journey and hit the subscribe button. And together, let's build an amazing life.
Ne réfléchis pas trop, la vie est courte, mon amour. Ne réfléchis pas trop.
In today's video, we are going to conduct our very first experiment, the wax experiment. And while it's more exciting to just jump right in and build a full-blown candle, it's actually not the best approach, especially if you are a beginner and you're not exactly sure what goes into building a great candle. If you missed my video where I shared a method on how you can go from ground zero, a beginner, to an expert in 3 easy steps, then click on the link below because I use that method to build this very first experiment. It's an easy method that gives me zero stress, zero overwhelm, and full of confidence as I tackle this very experiment. One of the core building blocks of a really great candle is using the right wax. Without it, you could have a candle that burns too fast or too slow, doesn't smell right, doesn't smell at all, has a lot of soot or smoke, and, well, just not a great candle. Let's explore the best type of candle to make by first exploring the right type of wax to use. Today, I'm going to explore 4 different types of waxes, and I'm going to show you how I approach every single scientific experiment. 1, I design the experiment. 2, I prepare the experiment. 3, I conduct the experiment, take notes and observations. And 4, I analyze, assess, and summarize my findings. Before we go off and experiment with a whole bunch of things, the very best thing to do is to design the experiment. This is where I see a lot of people get it wrong. They go straight into the lab without a game plan, and that is the fastest way to failure. So before we head off and experiment with different types of waxes, let's put together the experimental plan. When it comes to planning an experiment, one of the very first things you're going to want to ask is, what does done look like? And if you follow my APEX method, that is the very first question I ask under the P plan phase. For this experiment, I need to understand, I'm basically going to test 4 different types of waxes. And I want to know which wax is best for candle jars. That word best is something that I have to further define. But for now, I want to know which wax is best for candle jars. For a true experiment, I need to test in triplicate. Triplicate, or 3 samples of the same test, the minimum that's required to do a statistical analysis. 1 is a data point, 2 is a coincidence, and 3 is a trend. So for this experiment, I'm going to run 3 different candle jars to evaluate what's the best wax for candle jars. The second thing I want to define is, what is my experimental approach? Now, there are many ways that you can define the experimental approach. My suggestion is to always think through what's your approach to making the best experiment. For this experiment, I'm going to gather ingredients, gather the equipment. I need to calculate amount of wax needed per jar. I'm also going to need to calculate amount of fragrance to use. I will then prepare the jar and I will prepare the wax. I will make the wax formula. I will then pour the wax into the jars. Then I will test the wax. And then I will take notes and observations. And then finally, I will perform analysis to determine best wax. To really make sure I follow along with this entire game plan, One of the ways that I track my progress is I will use a stencil and I will put boxes in front of that item. The boxes are a quick cheat sheet for me to understand what has not been started, what has been started but in progress, and what are completed. How I use this is if it's an empty box like so, that means I haven't started on this particular item. However, if I shade it halfway, that means I've started it, but I haven't completed it. And if it's fully shaded all the way through a full solid box, that means that that particular item is completed. So this is a very effective way for me to make sure I'm following along with my experimental approach. One of the other things I need to define is how I'm going to measure the candles. In other words, what am I considering as best? One of the first things I want to test is how easy is it to use the particular wax? Ease of use. This particular measurement is going to be a subjective rating assessment. So I'm going to define 3 simple ratings. The first is if the wax that I use is easy, I will give it the highest number of points, which is 3. Medium to use is 2, and then hard to use is 1. The next metric is time to settle or time to solidify. Now, if I'm only making 1 candle and I'm using as a hobby and nothing more, it's not that big of a deal. However, if I plan on making this into a business and I want to produce a lot of candles to meet orders, I'm going to need to find the type of wax that solidifies very, very quickly. That way shipment isn't delayed and folks can get their candles. With this, it's just how many hours, or depending on the type of wax, because I haven't really tested yet, I don't know how long it takes to solidify. It's either hours or days to become a solid. The next thing I want to look at is its overall appearance. Be great if I can have a nice burning candle, but if it's not that great looking of a candle, who's going to ever want it? So I'm going to also define the appearance because it's very subjective in terms of a rating. If it was a flawless candle, perfect in every way, I'm going to give it the highest rating of 3. If it was good, but not perfect, I'll give it a rating of 2. And if it was terrible, meaning there is no way I would even pick up this candle if it was a shelf at the store, I will give it a rating of 1. Now I want to measure or to understand how well does the candle hold fragrance. What I learned is that there is a percentage that wax can hold. Some of the waxes will hold a small percentage. Other waxes will hold a higher amount of fragrance. Why this matters is I want to make sure that the candle smells really nice. However, if it cannot hold a lot of fragrance, then that candle won't smell very at all. One way to observe this is to see after the candle has solidified, does the fragrance form a pool? Again, this is also a rating. So if there are no signs of pooling, what I mean by pooling is that there's just a layer of fragrance that has seeped up on top of the wax and it lays there as a liquid. So if there are no signs of pooling or liquid, I will give this the highest rating of 3. If there are some pooling, minor amounts, maybe it's subjective if it is or not, then it's a rating of 2. And if there is terrible and lots of pooling, I will give that a rating of 1. Now, for this particular segment, I want to test the boundaries of how much fragrance I can add in. So as I move forward, I want to look at each of the waxes and I want to understand what is the max amount of fragrance to use. Also, what I learned is fragrance is one of the most expensive parts of a candle. So I really don't want to add too much fragrance and therefore it overwhelms your nose and it costs too much. So I want to know the max amount of fragrance to use. However, I also want to know the minimum amount to use such that I get a scent in it, i.e. it smells nice. If I use a minimum amount and that fragrance actually doesn't come through the wax, then that tells me that that wax isn't very good. So I need to understand how much wax I'm going to use and whether it's a minimum and also the maximum. In other words, I need to define the boundaries of how much fragrance to use. Now, one of the other things I want to test is what's called cold throw. Cold throw is where the fragrance stays in the candle candle and you can immediately smell that fragrance. This is also a rating. With this, I want to put a rating of if I can smell the fragrance immediately, I will give it a 3. If I can slightly smell it, I will give that a 2. And if there is no smell, I will give that a 1. What's very shocking to me is that a lot of these candles that I see in these luxurious department stores and some of these other home stores is that these candles will claim to have a really nice smell and scent to it. However, when I smell it, sometimes I can't smell it at all. I'm not sure if that's because my nose is overwhelmed, but a lot of times I will double check by asking my daughter, and she too cannot smell. If both of us cannot smell the fragrance, that tells me that that candle wasn't actually formed with the right wax. So it's very important to understand the cold throw. How much does that scent project through the candle? The next thing I want to test is what's called hot throw. This is similar to cold throw, where I want to see how much of that fragrance comes out from the wax. However, this is different because we are going to burn the candle and determine how much of that fragrance comes through. So if it has lots of smell after a given time point, let's say 1 hour, maybe 2, maybe 4. Again, I've never tested wax before, so I'm going to discover what's going to be the best time point for this. But if it has lots of smell, I'm going to give this the highest rating. If I can smell it, but it's not all that great or all that strong, it's going to be a 2. And if I can't smell at all, there's no smell, I'm going to give it the lowest rating of 1. I also want to test what's called the burn rate. Now, I have several different candles that I have bought in the past, and some of the candles, while it looks very luxurious in the candle, it's a good looking candle and it smells really nice, it actually burns really fast. And for the amount that I spent on that candle, I felt a little robbed. And so I want to test how fast does that wax burn. This, I'm going to test the height of the wax left over after 1, 2, or 4 hours. Again, I don't know what's the best metric. Maybe I measure it at all of these different hours. The next thing I want to test is what I consider burn quality. This is subjective, so I will also give it ratings. If the burn quality is good, it's a smooth burn, there's no issue, then I will give it its highest rating. If the burn has some minor issues, but still not bad for burning, I will give it a 2. And if there are lots of issues, I will give it a rating of 1. And then finally, I want to look at the amount of soot or smoke that comes from burning. This is something that I have read tends to be very prevalent with paraffin and not so much with soy. We're going to see if that's true or not. This also is going to be a rating. So if there is no soot or smoke when I burn this after, let's say, 1 hour, then I will give this the highest rating of 3. However, if this has minor soot and minor smoke, I will give this a rating of 2. And if it is lots of soot or smoke, it's basically a chimney in there, I will give this a rating of 1. All of this, ease of use, time to solidify, overall appearance, hold fragrance, cold throw, hot throw, burn rate, burn quality, and the amount of soot or smoke. This is a lot of measurement to take, but I want to gather it all because, again, this is my first experiment. I don't know what to expect. When I go through the experiment, I'm going to learn which one of these are going to be pretty much the same for all of them. So maybe ease of use is going to be the same for all of them, and therefore it's not something that I need to worry about. But there's also going to be other measurements in here that is going to help me differentiate between the different types of waxes. What's really cool is if I can gather all of this and log it into a database such as Excel, then as I move forward and build more candles, I'm going to be able to filter the different qualities I'm looking for by that rating or by that measurement, and that will help me quickly pick the type of wax I want to use as I move forward. But to answer the question of what does done look like, where I'm trying to define which is the best wax to use for candle jars, I actually need to test all of the candles and put it through statistical analysis. And for this, I am not going to spend a lot of time on this. Statistical analysis can get very heavy, dry, but also there's a lot of information on this. Just know that for this, I'm actually going to run what's called analysis of variation, aka ANOVA. And that'll help me define, out of all the things I'm testing, what is the best formula or wax to use as I move forward. The last thing I want to do is I want to log everything in a lab notebook. This is super important because, first of all, I need to have that lab notebook hardbound, i.e., don't make it easy to rip off pages. I know that many of us, myself included, have a tendency to want perfection. And if the lab notebook is messy, we want to start over. The problem is when we're in the actual experiment and we're writing everything down, everything between the procedure, how we approach things, what do we observe, what are our thoughts, those sort of things, all the details, that's rich information we can use in future experiments in case, for example, we want to pick up a failed formula and somehow tweak it. If we don't have all the details down and our comments or our observations, we're not going to be able to tweak that formula in the future. So very important, grab a hardbound notebook. And then the other critical thing, and this is something a lot of scientists miss, is I'm actually writing this lab plan in gel pen. Do not write in gel pen, write it in ballpoint pen. That is my holy grail, because what happens is you write your notebooks in gel pen and you make a spill, whether it's a chemical spill or a coffee spill or something, and then all of a sudden that gel pen tends to fade, wash out, and you lose all your information. So there you have it. Designing the experimental plan, the very first phase to ensuring that you have a successful experiment. I should know, I developed and launched over 65 products. If you want to see the next step in my very first wax experiment, or you want to follow along my journey as I scientifically discover and develop the very best candle, then hit like and subscribe so you don't miss out on when I release those videos. Next up, preparing for the experiment. Until then, take time to design the experimental plan. Be you, be bold, and be elegantly rebellious. See you in the next video.
Ne réfléchis pas trop, la vie est courte, mon amour. Ne réfléchis pas trop, la vie est courte. Ne réfléchis pas trop, la vie est courte, mon amour. Ne réfléchis pas trop.